You're listening to Mistreated. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Brain health is a woman's issue. Those are the words of Lynn Poslins, the founder and president of the Women's Brain Health Initiative, which recently hosted Canada's inaugural Women's Brain Health Summit in Toronto. So, why is brain health a women's issue? Women get migraines 3 times more than men, and studies show that for women aged 18 to 49, migraines are the leading cause of disability around the world. Some studies show that women are twice as likely to be diagnosed with anxiety and depression. According to CAMH, women's symptoms for depression are more severe. And would it surprise you that some 70% of Alzheimer's patients are women? Why is that? Is it genetics? Is it age? Historically, women have lived longer than men. But studies show that, quote, of every 3 patients with Alzheimer's, 2 are women, even after accounting for their greater longevity relative to men. And that, quote, postmenopausal women account for over 60% of all those affected. In short, we are only now learning the importance of hormones in brain health. In a TED Talk that quickly went viral in 2019, Lisa Mosconi, author of The Menopause Brain, broke down how in menopause, we usually associate hot flashes, brain fog, depression, and anxiety with changes in our hormones. But she states those changes are all neurological symptoms and they begin in the brain. She explained, why are our brains impacted by menopause? Our brains and ovaries are part of the neuroendocrine system. So the health of the ovaries is linked to the health of the brain and the other way around. Because estrogen is very important to our brains, Alzheimer's researchers are investigating whether estrogen therapy could help to ward off dementia in women. And since the FDA removed the black box off hormone replacement therapy, scientists are hopeful that this will help to foster more research. Canada recently approved a new drug to treat Alzheimer's, and research shows that the shingles vaccine could slow the progression of dementia. On today's episode, we speak to Professor Natasha Rajah about how menopause and hysterectomies can impact our brain health and why menopause is not a monolithic experience. We also talk about the work her lab is doing to better understand this and more. Professor Rajah joins me now. Thanks so much for being here. Could you please start by introducing yourself and what you do?
Sure. My name is Professor Natasha Rajah. I'm a full professor and Canada Research Chair Tier 1 in Sex, Gender, and Diversity at Toronto Metropolitan University. And I do research. The current main research project for my lab is called the Brain Health at Midlife and Menopause Study. And we're interested in looking at how menopause affects brain health and might be a window to understanding if certain females might be at risk for dementia later in life.
It seems like we don't know a lot.
Yes.
And the thing that I learned this year was that women weren't included in clinical trials until 1993, which is just like, I remember rap songs like, I remember Sir Mix-a-Lot.
Yeah.
Baby Get Back. That song is from 1993. And we're learning so much about the differences between men and women.
Yeah.
When we're talking about brain health, how is brain health different from men compared to women?
So we're still learning, but we do know that developmentally, like the body and the brain are connected systems, right? So I think one of the things that have come about is really people studying the brain without really considering how endocrine function, physiological function of the body will influence brain development as well.
What do you mean by that?
So how your gonadal and your sex development will influence like the hormones that are in your body and how hormones have effects throughout the body, both in the body and in the brain. And so it will lead to different differentiation and different patterns of development, both in development and then also potentially as we age. So the reason historically people haven't really looked at whether or not the neural correlates of brain aging differ by sex is because behaviorally, often the patterns are similar. So males and females will show memory-related declines with aging. And because the patterns of behavior are the same, people assume that the underlying mechanisms must be the same. But something that my lab started to do is challenge that and look at whether or not there are sex differences in the underlying mechanisms of age-related memory decline. And what we noticed was we were shocked because we were using a data-driven method, and we all the results pointed to sex differences. And it wasn't something I was anticipating. I'd been doing this research in aging for quite a while, and I never really explored sex myself, thinking, oh, behaviorally they're similar, so there probably isn't any sex differences. But then when we looked at the neural mechanisms, it was just a wake-up call to me. It was just, wow. So in females, what we noticed was a lot of the results that were been out there as far as the cognitive aging literature might have been driven by females, because females tend to volunteer for research more than males in the older adult population, but no one disaggregated the data by sex, so we didn't know.
So everything was in the same pool?
Yeah, everything was in the same pool. What we noticed was only in females did we see age-related differences in frontal and parietal function. In males, there wasn't any age-related differences, and that implied to us that perhaps females are using different types of cognitive processes to maintain memory function and to try and do the memory tasks that we were challenging them with. And so that really was like a wake-up call saying, oh, so all of these effects that we've been looking at in the frontal cortex, are they driven by females or what? So we decided to go in and deep dive into looking at sex differences, brain health equity in my lab at that point.
When I was younger, I don't think I really thought about my brain health.
Yeah.
It was more like, okay, how do I look in those jeans?
Yeah.
Don't judge me. But as I've gotten older,
Yeah.
it's something that I'm thinking about a lot. Is it true that approximately 70% of those suffering from Alzheimer's in Canada are women?
Yes. So 2/3 of Alzheimer's disease cases are in females in Canada.
That's shocking.
It's shocking.
Why is that?
So historically, the assumption was that it's because females live longer than males on average, and Alzheimer's, as all dementias, are diseases of aging, and that's why there's such a disproportionate effect. But what a lot of researchers started noticing is that when you look at individuals with Alzheimer's disease, there's a genotype called the apolipoprotein E epsilon 4, which it's a genetic risk factor for late onset Alzheimer's disease. And what people started noticing that there's a disproportionate portion of females with that genotype compared to males in these Alzheimer's clinics. And so that pointed to, okay, it's not just age, perhaps there's something about this genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's disease that has a greater effect in females. And then the research started coming out in the 90s and in the 2000s, and it's still coming out right now, that what does this gene do differently in females and males? And in females, what we know is it leads to earlier accumulation of some of the neuropathologies associated with Alzheimer's disease and a steeper decline in females. So this is something that seems to be female specific. This gene is important for cholesterol transport. It's important for vascular health. It's important for inflammation. So it's, this gene is a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, but the mechanism by which it acts, we're still studying and we're still trying to determine the details, but it seems to interact with all of these health factors that are modifiable as well at midlife. So that's why it's a really interesting result.
I think it also shows the importance of studying with different sexes.
Yes, exactly.
Because if it's impacting majority women and you're not studying it that way,
exactly,
then I'm sure there's gaps that fall.
Exactly. And so historically people just did not consider how biological sex might be and gender related factors such as social determinants of health, which are also very gendered, how they might interact with our biology and contribute to different profiles of risk and outcomes. And so in the case of Alzheimer's disease, exactly, the assumption was, oh, females are living longer and that's why. And then these kind of other findings were popping up, and then people decided, yes, it's time to look at sex differences. We can't really hide this. There was a lot of strong advocates for it, and people started listening, but it takes advocacy and it takes the scientist that wants to ask the question.
What roles do hormones play in brain function?
Hormones play a huge role in body and brain function. And so we know that within the brain, there's multiple different types of estrogens. So estrogen is not a single chemical. There's many types, and they have different. Yeah, so there's different factors and different ways in which they function in the brain. And the primary one that most of us study or are interested in is estradiol 17 beta, or E2. And that type of estrogen has receptors in the brain in two key brain areas important for memory and cognition. the hippocampus, which is a critical area of the brain for memory. So damage to the hippocampus leads to amnesia. Some of you might have heard of a scientist named Brenda Milner. So she did a lot of research on this patient, HM, who had damage to the hippocampus, and he could not learn new information, and he had really poor memory. And so the hippocampus is a key part of the brain for learning new things and remembering things. And then the prefrontal cortex, which is very important for organizing behavior, predicting the future, perspective, planning, our sense of self, things like that. So it's very important for what neuroscientists will call cognitive control. And so here are two brain regions that are really enriched for estrogen receptors. And they're really important for a lot of types of cognitive behaviors as well. So when there's estrogen-related fluctuations, you could imagine how the way that these regions function and communicate with other areas of the brain, because the brain is a large-scale neural network, it has profound effects across many different behavioral domains.
When I was going through my health issues, I kept hearing from friends, oh, it could be perimenopause, and something that comes up a lot. Well, I think there's a lot of confusion about perimenopause and menopause.
Yes.
They're two different things.
They're different stages.
Can you explain to us the
Sure.
difference? Yeah.
So in midlife, most of us enter midlife and we're premenopausal. I say most of us because some people do enter perimenopause in their 30s.
As early as 35, right?
Yeah, some people menopause before the age of 40. Right, so, but on average, spontaneous menopause, if you have ovaries, occurs in Canada at the average age of 51. And so you're premenopausal, meaning you're having regular cycles, you're still, reproductively fertile, and you still have like the menstrual cycle, like the luteal phase, the follicular phase. It's very stable, and it happens. And then things start to change in your body. Your ovaries, your eggs are getting fewer. Your estrogen starts to increase and kind of fluctuate. And so it is fluctuating during perimenopause, but it is on the slow decline. So it's jumping around, but it's slowly declining. And so perimenopause is a time where females might experience night sweats, difficulties in sleeping, start to have urinary tract infections, have, dryness down there.
Itchy ears.
Itchy
Frozen
skin.
shoulder.
Yeah, frozen shoulder, all sorts of interesting side effects of this natural phase in human aging, like female aging. I do like to highlight that it is a natural process, but some females do experience, 60% of females report having brain fog and memory complaints. And so it is a phase of a lot of change. Your body is really rewiring its system, like your body and brain is rewiring as there's this slow decline in a primary sex hormone in the female body. And then eventually it declines to the point that it's not even measurable by like traditional techniques that we use in the lab called ELISA. And you stop having periods altogether. You no longer are releasing eggs. You're no longer reproductively, healthy, I guess, or I don't like to use the word healthy, but reproductively fit, right? So, and you enter menopause. So menopause is technically defined medically as 1 year of no cycling. So if you're spotting after menopause, it's often important you go visit your doctor because that's not a natural part of menopause to spot after you've menopaused. But you do spot, here and there until you reach menopause. And then it's 1 year of no cycling, no spotting, no periods.
And that's menopause.
That's menopause.
Thank you for...
Up to that point, you're perimenopausal.
Thank you for explaining that because I think we're seeing a lot of things online where it's the same thing and it's two different things.
It's two different things.
Perimenopause can last 10 years and this, circus of horrors goes on. Yeah. But one of the things that people always say when you're going through the change is the night sweats and the brain fog. And it's got like cute words, but it's actually quite scary when you are in the prime of your life and your brain is not working the way. Yeah. And I should also mention that studies do show that even though we're going through perimenopause and have brain fog, it doesn't mean that women are less capable in the workplace.
No, not at all.
But I think that also leads to people not talking about it because you also don't want people to think like you're not as capable as you used to be.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. I think historically there's been a hesitance to talk about women's health because of this concern about how we are perceived and how we will be treated because the history of womanhood in society. And so we've been hesitant to talk about it. But aging is related to a lot of things as well. And I always like to frame menopause within the context of healthy aging because we're all aging, males and females. And, there are differences in our cognition as we age and in our bodies as we age. And we study that because we want to optimize our aging and make sure people age as well as possible. So why not do the same with menopause? Like we need to optimize how females experience this very natural part of endocrinological aging, right?
Well, explain to us how it works because as we've been talking about, estrogen tends to fluctuate throughout a woman's life, but never more so, I guess, during menopause. What happens to a woman's brain at this time?
So we're just starting to understand what's happening to the woman's brain during menopause transition, and that's the primary focus of what the research in my lab is doing. And there's two things that we're trying to address. So first, there's a big debate of whether or not some of these changes that females experience subjectively, can we objectively, valid, like, yes, this is true. You are experiencing memory decline. Like it's not, because a lot of times females will go to the doctor and they'll be told, it's just, that's fine. Like it's just subjective. You're not really showing any decline. And many tests are insensitive to showing an objective measure. And so one of the things that my lab designed was a memory task that really does objectively show that at menopause, there is an age-related decline. So we use this task called a spatial context memory task. It's very scientific, something you do in a lab. But it's something we actually do in real life as well. So we ask people to memorize faces and the place they are on a screen. And it's something you do day to day. You park your car, where is it in the parking lot?
I forget every day.
Exactly. I took a photo now, right, just to know exactly where it is. But so we test this ability, the ability to memorize a face and its spatial location. What we notice is this type of task, which is a very challenging task, is sensitive enough to validate that, yes, objectively, females at menopause show an age-related decline on average. And I always like to stress the on average because not all females show this decline, and the level of decline varies across females. And so what we're trying to understand is what accounts for that variation. Is it their vascular health? Is it inflammatory biomarkers in their blood? Is it having genetic risk factors for Alzheimer's disease? And then what we need to follow up with is it transient or is it something that is chronic? And we hope that for the vast majority of females, it is something transient, right? As the system is the plasticity of the system during this transition, it's rewiring itself. And as it adjusts, things will kind of get better. And we might even adopt new ways of being that are healthier in the long term as we age. But for some females, it might not be transient, it might be chronic, and they might be the females that really need intervention and attention to kind of promote healthy aging and prevent or delay the onset of dementia. And that's what the research is focused on.
Something I've been seeing a lot online is that when women get to a certain age, they stop doing the people pleasing, which I am very much looking forward to. But a surgery that seems to be the go-to for a lot of females who are experiencing gynecology illnesses like fibroids is hysterectomy. Hysterectomy is the second most common surgery for women behind a C-section. But I recently found out that getting a hysterectomy, depending on your age, if you're too young, can actually increase the likelihood for a woman developing Alzheimer's later in life. Why is that, and why aren't we talking more about that?
Sure.
Because what the?
Yeah, and I too was offered hysterectomy because of fibroids and opted not to get it for these reasons. And it always depends on how extreme your fibroids are and how much it's affecting your quality of life, your decision. But it's because the blood supply to the ovaries are altered. So if you do get a hysterectomy, you need to have a conversation with your doctor about keeping your ovaries, if possible, just because they are the primary source of your, peripheral estrogens. And if it's not possible, then you do need to have a conversation with your doctor about the options of doing menopause hormone therapy to kind of mitigate the loss of estrogen suddenly after a oophorectomy. But even if you do keep your ovaries, the blood supply to the ovaries can be altered. It really depends on the surgeon, right? Like there are surgeons that are better at surgery and others that aren't. And sometimes they do nip some blood supply, and sometimes there is a lack of blood supply to the ovaries, which will lead to it not functioning optimally. And so that's why some females that, even if they maintain their ovaries and have their hysterectomy, their uterus removed, may still show some cognitive decline with aging, especially if they're not treated appropriately with hormone replacement therapy.
And so that's how it's related to the brain health.
Yes.
Because of the estrogen.
Yes, exactly.
My health went downhill after I got COVID for the first time. And again, it was kind of like, what's going on? Do I have perimenopause? Is it long COVID? And a lot of my girlfriends were having similar conversations and talking about the brain fog, which can be a side effect of long COVID or perimenopause. And now we're seeing more studies that show that women are actually more likely to be impacted by long COVID. Do we know why that is?
We do not know why that is, and that needs to be studied. There are many mechanisms that are potential, like vascular health and inflammation, especially if you're going through perimenopause and menopause during that time, because the decrease in estrogen does relate to an increase in vascular risk and an increase in inflammatory response or immune reactivity. So there are, if you're going through perimenopause and there's, a disease that affects the inflammatory system, like COVID does, you might have this double kind of hit. But we need to, this is ongoing research, and I am not a specialist in COVID, so I would not want to say something that, may not translate or may not hold up in the long run.
I want to talk again about perimenopause and menopause. According to reporting from the New York Times, women of color experience perimenopause differently. Black women experience it earlier and more severely. Asian American women, a group that includes women who are of Chinese, Korean, South Asian, and Filipino backgrounds, studies have found that they were more likely to experience chronic pain and anxiety as opposed to hot flashes. Why is it important to recognize that perimenopause, menopause impacts different populations differently?
Because the treatments that you offer are different, and also the lifestyle approaches might differ for these different communities. All females around the world who have ovaries experience menopause, and we need to understand the experiences within the context of these cultures, because we don't know how much is related to physiology and actual, cultural differences in physiology, cultural differences in communication style, cultural differences in the language that is used. Certain cultures might not even have the words for hot flashes, right? And so they may not use that term, but it's because, and so we might not think they have hot flashes, but they might. They just might use a different term. So we really need to understand how menopause is experienced across the world, and also what the average age of menopause is across the world. Because another thing that you hear a lot of is how, the age of menopause matters. And a younger age of menopause might be a risk factor for poorer health outcomes as we age. But we don't know if that's true for all females in all communities. That is based on Western standards and results that have happened in studies that have not represented more diverse populations. The average age of menopause in India is 47, right? 46, 47. So, and that means the average, that means females are entering menopause on average younger as well. Does that mean that Indian women are more likely to have poorer health outcomes as we age? I don't know. We have to study that. Same, the average age in African Americans is a bit younger, like 48, I believe. So what is that? How does that translate, these concepts of average age and early onset of menopause being poor health outcomes? And how do we disentangle menopause, right, which is a biological phenomena, from the context in which these females were born and raised, so the social determinants of health? Because the social determinants of health are the biggest modifiable factors for preventing dementia, delaying dementia, and for aging well, and for health in general, optimizing health in general. And so we know that, but to implement changes in social determinants of health, it really is a policy. These are policies that need to be adopted at a governmental level, and to help people age better. And by age, I mean not just older age, I mean age. Like you're developing and then you're aging. Right. And we need to start thinking of aging as a life course as well. We're aging from the time we're young adults.
My daughter says we're born to die.
Yeah.
I'm like, you're too wise to be 12 years old. And I guess also, too, the dangers, if you have this idea of the age of when females are supposed to go through menopause, is if you're younger and if you are from a culture, a background that might go through it younger, if you go to get help, they might dismiss your symptoms as being nothing to worry about. You mentioned the social determinants of health. What role do they play when it comes to our brain health? Because I don't think a lot of people realize how we live or where we live can impact how we age.
Yeah. So this concept in cognitive aging called cognitive reserve, it comes from the literature in dementia, where we observed that there's some individuals, as they age, they seem to maintain their cognitive health later in life, but then once they are diagnosed with dementia, they show a steeper decline. And so individuals started looking at their brains using PET imaging and then autopsy. And what we noticed was these individuals actually had more neuropathology in their brain when they got diagnosed, but were able to maintain their cognitive function despite the presence of these neuropathologies. And so this implied to us that, there's this ability in the human brain to kind of compensate and make up for this damage that's accumulating in the brain. And this concept is cognitive reserve. And so cognitive reserve is related to social determinants of health. So we know that higher education, leads to more cognitive reserve. People that are more educated tend to age well and maintain cognitive function longer. We know that eating healthy, having a good lifestyle, and maintaining, lower body mass, like lower hip to waist ratio, is good for aging as well. So we know these kind of cognitive reserve variables are good. Living in an area that's not polluted, has a lot of green spaces. There's a lot of research coming out that these social determinants of health help bolster cognitive reserve and help maintain healthy aging for individuals. And so we're starting to kind of tease apart, how does this relate to different communities around the world? Is it just in North America, things like, and in Europe? So we're starting to understand that. But in general, there is this concept of social determinants of health and its relationship to cognitive reserve and brain resilience. And so this is something that needs to be studied to identify what social determinants of health are the most impactful. So, education policies, is that where we should be putting money as a government and as a country to make education more accessible and less costly for people, because it really does help people as they age as well. So things like that, that's what social determinants, why they're important.
I've also heard even racism can play a role in your brain health.
Yeah, and so that's there's social determinants of health and then structural determinants of health, where systems are built to kind of support certain communities and hinder other communities, and then the structural effects of that. So the racism that you see in society, the stress. So stress is an interesting thing because it's a biological phenomena, it's how you experience the world and then how it translates into your body. And stress itself is not a social determinant of health, but it probably is one of the major mechanisms by which having poor social determinants of health, so living in poverty, not having good access to high quality foods, not being able to sleep well at night because it's noisy out or you're scared for your safety, things like that. All of these things accumulate stress in your body, and that will have negative outcomes on brain health and aging, starting from young adulthood and mental health.
Because even we know that groceries are very expensive. We have a lot of food deserts. Some people just don't have, if you're living in an environment where you don't have access to that, it's pretty much, it seems as if when you think about how you're getting older, how you're aging, it's already determined how your brain health is going to be when you get old. It just seems so unfair.
It's unfair, and this is why in some ways people are like, well, you need to exercise, you need to eat well, and it's coming from a place of privilege to say that, because not everyone can afford to take the time to exercise. Not everyone has the money in their bank to eat healthy. So really, we as researchers can come up with, this is the ideal lifestyle, like the Mediterranean diet, getting cardiovascular training, doing strength training. But the ultimate question is, how do we make society more equitable so everyone can access these things? Because if we might know the solutions, but then to enact them into policy, that goes beyond the researcher, right? the research, what we do as researchers is we find these results and then we communicate to the public, and then some of us will, become advocates or go that advocacy route to really push for policy change, to integrate what we know from research. But that needs to happen for that translation. If that doesn't happen, it doesn't translate, and we might sit on a mountain of knowledge that cannot actually be implemented because that's beyond our power.
I wanted to talk about solutions and a way forward. You've mentioned policy. What should our governments be doing to support women's brain health?
Invest in it. Canada is not investing in women's brain health at this moment. There are researchers like myself who are funded and well funded by Tri-Council grants that are, so there's NSERC, SSHRC, and CIHR. They're the three major funding bodies in Canada. They have not had a significant increase in funding from the federal government for many, many years. And the cost of doing research has increased. So in some ways, by not increasing funding to these funding agencies, you're actually hurting researchers. You're actually reducing the amount of funding available because the cost of research has gone up. We're all encouraged to pay our students a living wage, right? We're encouraged to pay our staff a living wage. That living wage is increasing, as we all know. And as researchers, a lot of these, we want to take care of our staff and our students.
But that money then is going away from the research
exactly. And then the cost of actually purchasing the equipment, doing the tests that we need to do our research, those costs are going up too. Everything's going up, but our funding line has not. And so this really hurts research in general in Canada. And as a result, people see women's health research as a niche thing, and that needs to change. It's not a niche thing. Women's health is health for all, because by studying women, we actually learn a lot about men as well, and what works for women and what works for men. And if we always hear about precision medicine and using AI tools. Well, AI only works if you have the base data to develop the AI tools, but we don't have the data on women, and we don't have the data on diverse populations. So in order to really get to a precision health in our society, which is what everyone wants, we need to study women, and then we need to study the intersectional identities of people as well.
And we make up 50% of the population.
Exactly. And we need, what most researchers can do is recruit women into your studies if you're doing human subject studying, and if you're doing animal studies, test female animals as well, and disaggregate your data. A lot of people have the data. They just haven't looked at it through a sex and gender-based analysis lens.
Well, what can individuals do to protect their own health? Because systems, I think we're all exhausted. We're all just trying to do the best that we can. Yeah. What can individuals do to make sure that when they do get to a certain age, because a lot of our brain health, the diseases, don't just happen. No. They take decades to develop, right?
Exactly. And so there are many things that you could do, starting at a young adulthood, trying your best to adopt a healthy lifestyle. One thing you can do is quit smoking. That's a modifiable risk factor that will save you money, right? So smoking, we know that that's one of the biggest risk factors for late life dementia, and it's modifiable, and so you could quit smoking. You could reduce your alcohol intake, again, saving some money, but we do know that high levels of alcohol intake is detrimental to aging. So there are things you could do that will actually save you money. Quit smoking, quit drinking, not quit, but reduce the amount. And you could also prioritize sleep. So sleep doesn't cost you anything.
But if you have night flashes, you can't sleep.
I know. But prioritizing sleep. There are new medications on the market that are purely for hot flashes. I'm not an advocate. I am not paid by the drug companies or anything, but I'm curious about how this will, work. And whether that's a good alternative, especially for females that are concerned because they do have, contraindications for taking menopause hormone therapy. So that's another thing. Women can approach the doctor and advocate for themselves to consider menopause hormone therapy, but you really need to, talk with your doctor, find a doctor that's open to these conversations, and consider your personal history, whether or not you have a history of heart attack and stroke, because these hormone replacement therapy, it does increase risk of these things. And so cardiovascular health is important to consider, your family history of cancer. But when it comes to family history of cancer, I will say that the original scare from the Women's Health Initiative study, it was, the percentage of risk was not as high as people were led to believe. And I know a person that has, personally had a breast cancer scare and, was treated for breast cancer and was on menopause hormone therapy afterwards. So it is possible. You just need a doctor that's willing to walk that path with you and treat you and see you regularly to make sure that you can maintain menopause hormone therapy while still maintaining the rest of your body's health. Taking HRT right now, it's thought that it's best to take it when you enter perimenopause and into menopause, but then to stop taking it, like not to stay on menopause hormone therapy long term, because we still don't know about the long-term effects, and there's mixed results as far as the cost and benefits. There are some studies from the UK Biobank, led by Claudia Barth and others, that show that women that have a history of staying on menopause hormone therapy long term, they showed more hippocampal volume loss and more gray matter loss. So we don't know why.
Because we don't study women's health.
Yeah, we don't study women's health. And this is just like a cross-sectional data. Like what we need is a large-scale longitudinal study that really considers historically the different sex-specific experiences of females. Like we want to understand women's body health and brain health. We need to study from menstruation through parity pregnancies, through menopause, like longitudinally, at least cross-sectionally, put a bunch of studies together that are longitudinal in nature to really get a full map of how do women age, right?
It just makes me really upset to think of all the millions of women who've had to suffer as we just play catch up to, the lack of funding, the lack of research. For you, what makes you hopeful?
What makes me hopeful is that there's a lot of female scientists and male scientists that are advocating for this in Canada, in Europe, in the US. I think we realize how much biological sex and sex-specific experiences shape our brain health and our body health. And people are understanding more and more that the brain is not living in isolation, that things that happen in our body and in our environment affect our brain health. And so there is this growing awareness of brain-body interactions and social context and its effects on brain health. And there is a movement, I think, within the neuroscience community to really invest in research that looks at this and that puts women's brain health at the forefront. Like that is the first thing we should be doing in order to get a bigger picture of how how brain health evolves over the lifespan. Women that are considering taking menopause hormone therapy, and I've said this on social media and sometimes get backlash for it, but it is important to find a doctor that listens to you and not to just follow the advice of individuals on social media that may not have the training. And I understand that there's frustration in the space because a lot of females are talking to their doctors and are being shut down or told, you're being silly, right?
Just lose 5 pounds.
Yeah, exactly. And that's not cool either. Like sadly, we have to be our own advocate and listen to our own bodies. And so that's the other thing I'd like to say. If you do go on menopause hormone therapy, listen to your body. If your body doesn't feel right, you should talk to your doctor about that, not just, I wanted to do this, so I'm just going to stick to menopause hormone therapy. Because from my personal experience, right, I went on menopause hormone therapy because I was having hot flashes, and then I started to feel tightness in my chest. And so I had to listen to that. And I went through, visited a cardiologist, got my heart checked, and they gave me the green light to keep staying on it. And so I went back on it, but there was a moment where you have to listen and say, okay, is my heart healthy enough to be on menopause hormone therapy, especially if you have a family history of heart attacks or stroke, like my family does. And so you need to listen to your body. So you're the best advocate for yourself.
Professor Rajah, it's been such a pleasure. I've learned so much. You make a complicated subject quite, you know how to communicate really well. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
I appreciate you being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
That was Mistreated. Thanks for listening. You can follow our show wherever you get your podcasts so that you can get notified each time a new episode is available. We would love to hear your feedback. You can write me an email at mistreatedpodcast@tvo.org or reach out on my social channels. We've got some reaction to our last episode on craniocervical instability and Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. Thank you so much for interviewing Sydney and bringing attention to craniocervical instability, CCI. What patients are facing across every province in Canada is devastating and can have lifelong impacts. We lack trained experts, accessible care, and clear diagnostic criteria. One of the shocking things I've learned about these conditions is how few people are in the country who can help to diagnose and to treat craniocervical instability and Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. So a lot of people end up fighting for care, and if they have the financial means, they travel outside of Canada to get that care, and it shouldn't be that way. We have another comment from last week's episode. There are so many underdiagnosed and mistreated citizens in Canada. Canadian healthcare and governments need to take care of its people, and it is clearly doing a failing job despite being a wealthy country. Thank you, TVO, for your professional journalism, and kudos to Sydney for articulating a very complex topic. CCI and EDS are incredibly complex issues, and as we mentioned last week, Mistreated will be investigating what is going on with treatment, diagnosis, and how patients are being impacted. Look for that in early 26. We've got one more comment. Healthcare is a human right. Governments need to step up more to unburden citizens from this healthcare tragedy. We really appreciate all of those comments, and my deepest appreciation to Sydney for using her voice to bring attention to this. This is our last episode of the year, but we will be back in January 2026. Thank you so much for all the support on this podcast. And as mentioned, email us your suggestions, your comments, and we will try to incorporate them into the podcast. This week's episode was produced by Matthew O'Mara and me, edited by Colin Kish, camera work by Max Stussy, digital shorts by Ariana Longley, prompting by Christy McLeod. Production support from Jonathan Hallowell and TVO's Digital Media Services team. Laurie Few is the executive producer of Digital. John Ferry is vice president, programming and content. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you in 2026.